record on this computer. Perfect. All right. Now I'll hit share and get to the right page all at the same time. Novel idea. There we go. All right, my friends. Last week we talked about the suffer the little children and come to me. Not the suffering, suffer the little children. Spell check there. Autocorrect. Divorce and riches, right? The rich young ruler who can't give things up. That was the beginning of this chapter. Now, like we said last week, all three are pretty tough. They have challenges in different ways. Today we start looking ahead towards Jerusalem in general, because the end of chapter 10 is the end of Jesus's public ministry. Really, then we shift, and chapter 11 starts with the triumphal entry to Jerusalem. And so we start to shift towards Holy Week and to the cross fully with chapter 11. So all that said, we'll jump right in. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And he took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." So this is a strange opening. We just had the whole story of the rich young ruler, and it's just sort of this weird, like, why are people amazed or afraid or anything? He's just sort of walking on the road to Jerusalem. The teaching before, maybe it was hard a little bit, but not the end of the world. It's a weird opening. It's one of those kinds of things that you just sort of go, this is a weird transition. Jesus is super clear about being killed, and no one really even seems to engage. They just sort of go, oh, okay. We can say that Jerusalem is on a hill, so geographically you have to walk up a hill and walking up is the way that you would approach the city. Of course, more than people have said that Mark's also making that reference to the cross that is up the hill as well, that we have to go up to Jerusalem. We have to go up to the cross. We have to go up the mountain to the final showdown, right? All of that can be read in there, but there's not a whole lot more to this passage. This is where those scholars theorize that maybe we're missing a story, or there's some action that comes from another tradition. Who knows? We just know either Mark really did a bad job of adding this to his story list, or he just sort of dropped it in there. That said, any thoughts on that opening prediction of crucifixion and death? Fine if we don't. It does flow a little bit into the next, which continues. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." All right, so this time Jesus gets to deal with power and the pursuit of power. That is, James and John asked to sit at the head table, clearly ignoring that Jesus had just said, I'm going to be betrayed and died. I mean, literally, Jesus just said, hey, we're going to Jerusalem. They're going to kill me. And they go, hey, we want to sit your right hand and your left. It's a really weird disconnect. Again, Mark shows, if nothing else, once again, the disciples don't have a clue, right? We can say a lot of other things about them. They can't catch a clue. They have no clue what they're doing. Like, you're going to die? Can I sit on your right hand and he's on your left? What? Okay.
Bless their hearts.
Bless their hearts indeed. Placker has a great quote about this. They have understood neither the egalitarian character of the new community nor the suffering that awaits Jesus. Right? They didn't get any part of it. They missed it all. And so Jesus challenges them on both of those fronts, right? First, he talks about you have to be baptized with the baptism which I'm about to be baptized, right? It's sort of an interesting turn of phrase, which we know now looking back is talking about the cross, right? About the horrible death that he's about to die. It's interesting though, the word baptized can mean baptized, but it can also mean flooded with calamities. It can be sort of overwhelmed. And so the idea is this idea of you're partway towards drowning. Baptism has that connotation to it, that you are almost overwhelmed, flooded with calamities, drowned to a certain degree. For those who don't know, this was the original practice of the church, was that they would push this image of drowning and of being dying to your previous life. There were instructions that actually the priest is supposed to hold you underwater until you actually fight to come back up. That was the original, some of the baptismal instruction. It was not just this nice ceremonial drops on the head in the Episcopal Church, but it was literally you push them down until they're about to lose their breath, and then you let them come back up when they're starting to panic, give or take. Why? Because we're to die to our old lives, we're supposed to die to our old ways of being. We're supposed to die to our old selves, right? And you can't do that without getting a little panicked and realizing that you're doing something pretty serious. So death was always part of baptism. But again, we tend to focus on the new life so much, we tend to skip the dying part, the giving up the old, the renouncing evil, all those kinds of things get much shorter shrift, but it's always been part of that baptismal conversation. And so when Jesus says, are you prepared to be baptized with the baptism I have to receive, right? It is that kind of same thing of you have to go through death to get to life, not it's just a free pass to go straight to the front. Plus, then of course, drink the cup is the image that Jesus uses in the last, not the Last Supper, but when he's in the in Gethsemane and begging and trying to figure out what comes next. Take this cup away from me. He doesn't want to drink it, but of course has to. Many scholars note that all the disciples, except for John, die a martyr's death. 11 of the 12 end up dying for a variety of reasons, a martyr's death. Of course, Judas probably not a martyr's death necessarily, but he dies as well. So when the 10 discover that this has happened, they're all mad, and probably also secretly wishing that they had asked themselves, because that's how all these disciples have worked so far. They aren't necessarily understanding what's going on. They're just mad because they got left out, not necessarily because those guys got ahead. They're all wrapped up in that same power conflict more than they are concerned about what it means. So Jesus then replies that service is proof of someone's greatness, which is a total revolution then, and let's be honest, now. We like to talk about servant leadership, but I know very few people that are actually servant leaders when you really talk about, I think, what Jesus is talking about. People who roll up their sleeves and get dirty constantly and are helping at all times. Usually the CEO of the company is about as far away from the taking out the trash moments as possible, right? And I'm pretty sure, we still don't get the whole servant leadership thing completely. We all want the best seats. Man, autocorrect did me in this week. We all want the best seats, the nicest things, and to be told we are great. we all want that, right? I mean, we like to have those honors and to be decorated. But that's literally, Jesus says it's the opposite of that, is how we learn greatness, by serving and caring for others. If you are ready to work and serve and put others first all the time, I'll include myself in that. There are plenty of times when I want something good to happen to me and I'm not ready to do all the work and service that needs to get done. Thoughts here, thoughts on the exchange. Again, God bless those disciples. They sure didn't get this one right either.
Well, it's just amazing to me that they missed the entire point. You'd think if your dear friend told you that all these terrible things are about to happen to him, you'd be concerned about that. Yeah. I mean, they weren't even like, oh no, this is horrible.
Right.
They just went immediately to, okay, what could I get out of this situation? Okay, when you come into your glory, how about I'm on the right and I'm on the left?
Yeah.
Forget all the things you're going to go through, It's like,
yeah, sheer sympathy, you would think, would take it to another level, much less deep theological understanding.
I know, just some sympathy to say no. To think that your friend is about to go through this. But anyway.
I mean, to me, this is about sort of exploring what's the good news. Because, we ended the part we read last week with the story of the great reversal. So, I mean, he's, I mean, Peter has said, wait a second, we left everything and followed you. And he goes on to say, oh, it's going to be great. It's, you will receive, more than you could have ever expected. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. And then, it's as if Mark wants to sort of elaborate on that, because then Jesus tells them what's going to happen in Jerusalem, and it's really in more detail than before. He's talking about how the religious authorities would hand him over to the Romans, and and clearly, I mean, I think this is supposed to be part of the good news. I mean, because he does say, after 3 days he will rise again. But again, this concept of what the good news is, and then how it applies in the lives of the disciples, how they're going to live out the good news, is foreign. And I mean, I think Mark understands that, again, the reader is sort of in the place of the disciples. Why is this good news?
Yeah.
And you're supposed to say, okay, how do I apply that in my own life? That, I mean, there's a death and there's a resurrection.
Yeah. Totally.
In Mark, the disciples never ever get it until the end.
Right.
Yeah.
In the end, they finally do.
Yeah.
Just barely. You can maybe make the argument they don't at the end, even if they do, but yes.
Well, I mean, when by the time you get to Acts, Bill, okay, we're seeing something very, very different than we're seeing here in Mark.
Yes, they get it eventually on that side. I'm just saying in Mark, I don't know. The Gospel of Mark seems to leave it pretty much that they don't have a clue.
Well,
because we don't get on the other side of Easter in Mark, right?
Because Mark, as you know, I mean, what is the end? We'll get to it, but the end of Mark, okay, still leaves you thinking, right? Okay.
Yeah, you're still trying to figure out what the good news is.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay, I mean, that's, yeah.
All right, we'll keep going because we shift a little bit for this next part. The conclusion, this is the conclusion of chapter 10 and really ultimately the conclusion of Jesus's ministry before that last week. So they came to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Come," or call him here. And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately, Euthus, he gained his sight and followed him on the way. All right, so we get old blind Bartimaeus here at the end. There's two ways to engage Bartimaeus. One as a healing story and one as a metaphor, winking kind of story. I'm going to go through both of them so you can sort of see the differences. The first you've probably heard lots of times. The second one people don't ever tend to hear too much, but it's just so you can hear some different ways of engaging the same story, using the exact same information and facts, but just in slightly different ways, right? So first we have the healing story. Then we'll look at that other interpretation. First up, so Bartimaeus is a Hebrew name meaning son of Timaeus, right? Bar in Hebrew means son of. And this is one of those things, whenever I do a Stump the Priest meeting with high school students, with the youth group, they always ask me the same thing. There's usually one kid who always goes, "What was Jesus's middle name?" Right? And I always go, "Well, it was Bar." His name was probably Yeshua Bar Yosef. That's how they named each other in those days, which was Jesus, son of Joseph, right? That would be his Hebrew name was most likely Yeshua. Jesus is the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew name. And then Yosef, of course, being his father. So Yeshua Bar Yosef would have been Jesus's full title or name growing up. Our story starts, though, with a redundancy because it says Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, which is literally saying the same thing twice, right? Now, if we go for that sort of first interpretation, Timaeus probably could mean one who was purchased or bought. Okay, so here's someone who might well have been a slave at some point. Or who perhaps even is being a disciple perhaps who might be bought or purchased in some ways. We'll talk about that in a minute. But so he calls out, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And son of David is one of the ancient messianic titles. And we can say unequivocally that there's only two people whose help called Jesus Messiah, and that is Peter and Bartimaeus. Period. No one else in the entirety of Mark get it. But here's a blind man who does somehow. The word call is used, which both then and now can be a call to ministry. That's because it's the same word that Jesus used to call the disciples. That same Greek word is used in both places and only in those two places. You don't hear Jesus calling someone else. It is only used for when he calls Andrew and James and John and Peter and all those guys at the beginning of the story. And now it's used here pretty much at the conclusion of the story, right? He throws off his cloak. Now, this was a beggar's only possession. Typically, they would lay it out and you would put your money on it and they could pick up the cloak to collect the money, right? Also, of course, kept them warm. The desert always cools off at night. It might be hot during the day, but in the evening, the temperature always drops precipitously. So it was both to keep them warm and the other. But this man, there's an interesting that turn of phrase, right? He throws off his cloak. Is he throwing off his life as a beggar? Is he throwing off all that he has, all of his possessions? There's the, he's collected all the money, so he just leaves all his money and his cloak and everything to go to Jesus. Could be either, could be both, right? But what we can say is he gives up more than the rich young man was willing to give up, right? He literally, the rich young ruler just before this couldn't give up anything. And here's a beggar who literally goes, I'll leave everything. I'll leave everything I got. Which of course, again, stands in stark contrast to others. And even, let's remember, to the disciples who also were like, wait a second, we left stuff. What do you mean we can't be rich? They still have a weird connection to wealth. Even though they did give up being fishermen and other things, they still obviously have a certain hold of it because they get offended and worried about this whole idea of wealth preventing you from going to heaven, because they thought, I guess, they were going to get rich on the back end of the deal, maybe. Who knows? So he asks then to see again, right? Jesus says, what do you want? Which is the same thing he had asked that rich young ruler, what do you want? And he said, oh, I need to know how to get into heaven. What's the option for eternal life? He says, I want to see. And Jesus heals him, but the term for heal in this case could also mean save. So which word is intended? He heals him, which he can see again. That seems to be one option. Probably both, right? It may just be a pun that Mark is sharing in that story. He both heals him and saves him, transforms his life. Or if he is one who is bought or who has been sold, then perhaps he redeems him, even, could be a term. That is, he claims him from whoever else had bought him. Bartimaeus then follows him on the way, and of course that was the earliest name for Christians, were those who followed the way of Jesus. So literally Bartimaeus then becomes really the one true disciple. We just watched the disciples fumble and fall and not have a clue what's going on. Then we have this blind guy on the side of the road who gets it better than any of the 12 get it at any point in the whole story. So it's a call narrative, and it is about that healing, but obviously it has that deeper level of what does it really mean to be a disciple, right? How do we engage that and throw off what we have to embrace a new life and follow him on the way? So that's the first interpretation. Thoughts on option one before we get to option two? We heard it this way. Sometimes people just teach it as a healing.
Well, I'm intrigued by the name. I guess at one level it probably showed, that is to say, when Mark says Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, at one level it probably shows that Mark was writing to an audience that didn't understand that Bartimaeus meant son of Timaeus. Right. But I'm intrigued that it can mean one who is purchased or bought, because Mark at the end of the last little passage before this has said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Mm-hmm. So we see, who's paying the price for Bartimaeus? Right.
Yep. It's all right there.
It's I can't but think that it was quite intentional that Mark uses this story to close this part of his gospel. We're bringing some points to conclusion in what he's trying to get across.
In other words, here he begins talking to us, right?
Could be. Yeah.
Well, we're told that those who have followed him were afraid. I mean, that's the word. I mean, that was right at the beginning of what we, this group is afraid. And, so again, I think Mark is sort of working with this, fear and trust are sort of incompatible, fear and faith. And Bartimaeus has no fear. He throws off the cloak. He gives up everything he's got. He's all in. He's following on the way, and he can see.
Yeah.
And the disciples still can't.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're still stuck in fear.
They're not getting it, that's for sure. Power or fear or money or pretty much everything that happened before. It looks like they're stuck in.
They're still in the economy of the world, and they haven't plugged into the economy of God.
Right. Absolutely. Any other thoughts before we look at option 2? I do love, so we didn't even talk about it because it's just sort of a straightforward, but I do love the sequence where basically he keeps calling out, he won't be turned away. He goes, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, and all that. And he says it over and over again, and they're like, be quiet, be quiet. They're all sort of shutting him up. And then Jesus says, hey, call him over here. And they're like, oh, ooh, you're so lucky. Come on. Like, it's this sort of hilarious turn of like basically all the disciples or whatever's gathered telling him to be quiet. And then suddenly he's oh, wow, okay. Jesus likes you. So now we like you, almost kind of response, right? Kind of silly turn right there in the middle of the story that you just have to laugh at and go, yep, that's how it always works, right?
I wonder, though, if you had had such a profound change as you're blind, now you can see, wouldn't you want to follow whoever made you to see, whether it's metaphorically or physically?
Yes.
So if you couldn't see and now you can see and go, that's a good person to follow. They really make things happen.
Yes. Then and now. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's right there. Right there. All right. So now the second option, this is a fun one and shows you just different ways we can see the same text. But I particularly love this one. So we, again, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. You have this weird intro, which evident also we have to name is right after. Basically, they say they went to Jericho and then they came out of Jericho. So Jericho also gets mentioned twice. The only other mention before this we really have of Jericho is, the walls of Jericho came a-tumbling down. Maybe that has a reference here. At the time of Jesus, Jericho was just this sort of nice sort of spa type town, and fresh springs, and was known for being a famous garden area. It was a favorite location of, and I'm not sure how they got involved, but Mark Antony and Cleopatra. I think Mark Antony gave it, or maybe Herod gave it to Antony, who gave it to Cleopatra, or something like that. I'd have to go back and do the research on that again. But this sort of interesting, like why Jericho gets mentioned twice. I've not seen anybody name that at all. Maybe y'all can think of those reasons. But Bartimaeus is the key if we're going to unlock this particular option of reading. The son of Timaeus. Now, to us, Timaeus means nothing, or to most of us, it means nothing. But the Timaeus was Plato's most famous work, or one of his most famous works, and explained how the world worked and philosophy's place in it. It was one of his sort of magnum opus books. It was a bestseller in the ancient world. Lots of people read it. You were taught from it. This is how you should understand the world as a Greek philosopher, or just as someone with wisdom in ancient Greece. We don't hear that obviously in the 21st century, but in the first century, I don't know, it'd be the equivalent of saying like I'm trying to even think of something remotely relevant, but it'd be like Bar Bible, son of the Bible, or something like that, right? I mean, it'd be, wait a second, that's a weird reference, right? I mean, yes, it could be that person, Bartimaeus, or the son of Timaeus, but this sort of seems to be somebody who is, and again, son of Timaeus would be someone who is a follower of Plato, the follower of the Timaeus, right? So it's very well known, and it was likely also Mark's target. We don't always tend to think about the gospel writers about living in a specific context and pop culture, for lack of a better term, at the time, but this is sort of, did the gospels occasionally make reference to the world around it in ways that we have maybe forgotten to this day. So the book, just to talk about the Timaeus, the book was all about how sight allows us to see the wonders of the world and allows us to observe how creation is put together, right? So the idea is we achieve great heights in philosophy because we can see and observe and then therefore understand the world, and we can see that it should be a better place. And Plato then creates this Platonic ideal, that is, there are things in this world that don't quite fit. Like you can have a tree, but it can get sick and die. But then there's an ideal tree that is beyond that we can think of and know that there's this ideal tree that lives and bears much fruit, right? Or is perfectly formed, even if the tree that we're looking at maybe is sick and dying or doesn't produce a lot of fruit. Regardless, the key was sight and how you see. Philosophers constantly talk about how you need to observe the world around you so that you can then understand it in greater detail. That was one of the great Greek mantras. That's how like Pythagoras came up with the Pythagorean theorem, right? He observed the world and began to notice that there are ways that you can describe it and engage it. It doesn't take a lot of leap then to say that this is likely a favorite book of the Gnostics, that is the what we now call heretics, but the group of folks who believed that wisdom and knowledge was very important to the world, and Asceticists who also had this idea, Asceticism, this idea that there were sort of two worlds. They follow this Platonic idea that there's a spiritual and the physical. And the Asceticism was one of the earliest heresies that the church had to deal with, where basically they took this ideal from the Timaeus, from Plato, and said Jesus was likely all spirit. He was the ideal human. And there was no physical crucifixion because he wasn't as much physical as he was spiritual. Like the important things that he shared is the ideal world that God wanted to reveal to us. That gets a little into the heresy of the world, but all of that's going on at the same time. Gnosticism and Asceticism were well known. And if we date Mark's book to 70 AD, both were very common teachings and explanations. So you've got the Timaeus on one hand, that's the story of all this philosophy. And then you have the heresies of Gnosticism and Asceticism that are connected with it deeply, that are really sort of this attempt by followers of Jesus to connect to Greek philosophy. All right. If we know that, if that's the background, then this story has a whole different meaning, right? Because the son of Timaeus is blind. He can't see. And yes, we would read that both literally and metaphorically, right? Like he literally can't see anything. And because he can't see anything, then he can't be wise. He can't be a philosopher. He is missing the whole world. And yes, Mark then is probably tweaking the nose of Plato and all who follow him and saying like, hey, what do you do if you can't see anything? I guess you're an idiot. I guess you can't see and you really don't understand how the world works anyway, because this is not a good idea, right? It's a clear shot about seeing is better than the rest of the world and certainly the religions around it. Philosophy was making a claim that philosophy was ideal and better than the religions of the world because you could see and observe the world and see that it could be better, and religion didn't do that. This is a pretty clear shot the opposite way, right? This is a common counter commentary on the Timaeus. Bartimaeus throws off his cloak. This was the ancient symbol of a philosopher. Only philosophers in Rome and in the Greco-Roman world would typically wear the specific word that's used for cloak. They would wear cloaks. And so when he's calling out to Jesus, hey, help me, help me, help me. Even though he is blind, he realizes that Jesus has something more to offer, and he is willing to throw off the cloak of the philosopher, the cloak that we have to see to really use anyway, and to claim this great philosophy mantle. He gives all of that up. He gives up the philosophy of Plato and of the Timaeus to follow Jesus. And then, of course, Jesus gives him not just sight, but true sight, a true view of the world and how the world works. And so when he saves him, when he claims him, when Jesus does all of that, then that's that true sight that comes with being a disciple of Jesus and understanding the world the way it really works versus this idealistic world that the philosophers tout. And then the ultimate insult, of course, is he follows him on the way, right? Jesus, he gives up completely Plato as teacher. Instead, he calls Jesus rabbi, teacher, right? And then he takes on this new teacher instead of Plato and follows him on the way, right? He becomes a disciple of Jesus instead of a disciple of Plato and of philosophy. All right, so he's doing three things at once. He's describing a true disciple as Jesus enters Jerusalem before the last week in this interpretation, right? So it's all the stuff that we talked about at first is there, but he's taking it to another level by mocking Plato and Greek philosophy by saying, you guys don't have any of that figured out. We've got it figured out. And he's also likely rejecting Gnosticism and Asceticism and saying, no, Jesus was a physical human being, and Gnosticism, there's no secret wisdom here. This is all right in front of us, and Jesus heals the person and to give him sight, and there's no secret sight. It's all God's sight. All right. So option two. So I will say I've only found this in conversations. AJ Levine and I have had this conversation, and we're both on the same page about this. And it's also in the book Holy Ground by Gordon Lathrop, a Lutheran pastor. So you don't see this in your average commentary. It's usually option one, and it's all about, and it's not wrong, neither option is wrong, but typically we focus on option one as, oh, here's what a true disciple looks like, right? Which I think is a great interpretation. I just think option two, you can do more than one thing at once in the same story, right? And sometimes Mark often gets knocked for being too simplistic. This may be a time when Mark was being a little more complex, and we should give him a credit for it. Anyway, thoughts on option two? Does that change your view? Is it, you buying it? Do you think it's different? What do you think? Does it do anything for you in your faith?
I think
What of option two?
There's so many parallels to the metaphor that it's hard to think that wasn't what Mark was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
But it's funny that it's not very widely talked about.
Might be a little out there.
You think it's a little out there? That's fine.
Yeah, I
It's
think
a
it's
thinker.
interesting to think about the contrast between the great reversal that Jesus has been teaching and what Plato has to say about the forms. The tree may be sick, but there's the form of the tree behind it. It's the idea that that death leads to new life is being contrasted with the Platonic approach.
Right. Yeah, it's a stumper. And I have to honestly confess, my knowledge of the Timaeus and of Platonic and Platonism is so very, very thin that I can't really get into the nuance, the depth, or any of it. I've basically read some overviews of the Timaeus and overviews of all of that, and how it's understood and how it's worked out. But in those overviews, they're all the same. You have this idea of wisdom and seeing, and that sight being able to help us interpret the wisdom of the way the world is ordered. Now, the irony of it is, they use Plato uses a very specific world to talk about how the world is ordered, that there is an organizing principle behind our world, that if you just look around, you can see that things are ordered in specific ways. And that order, that great way of understanding the world in Greek philosophy, does anybody know what that's called? It's the logos, the word. Then John picks that story up and runs with it instead and says, oh, I like that idea from Greek philosophy. The logos, the word was God, the word was with God, the word was God, and through him all things were made, right? So the Gospel of John literally picks up the logos, that idea of this organizing principle in the world, and claims it as the wisdom of God that is personified in Jesus, right? So Greek ideals are running all through our text because that's the world they lived in. So that part doesn't bother me to say pro or con what's going on here, but it is, it's hard to ignore. I mean, it'd be like us saying we didn't know about Jurassic Park or something like that in the 21st century. And you go, oh yeah, we got that. We got that reference, right? I mean, there's those kinds of things that looking back, it's hard for us to know what everything that's being referenced, and we may never know a variety of them because we just don't have that we don't live in that context. But there's lots of that stuff that's in our texts. Stumped you. I stumped you.
Well, I'm sitting here and contemplating it. Okay,
Yeah.
I don't know that it changes anything for me, because you asked, does it change my? Oh,
Sure.
it does. I'm just trying. Well, I'm just trying. Who was Mark's audience? Okay, I think that helps us understand better the interpretation. Who was Mark trying to reach? Okay, and I don't know that he was trying to reach Greek philosophers. I'm not sure. Okay.
Yeah.
He may have been writing to Romans.
Yeah.
That early? Okay, could have been. I mean, was he writing the Gentile community, do you think? Or, I mean, I'm not quite sure. I don't, because Mark was originally an oral gospel. Okay, so I mean, I'm just trying to think before it was written down. So it,
yeah.
At any rate, I'm just, it really depends. Either interpretation, I think, almost depends on the audience. That's all.
Well, sure.
I mean, I think Mark is sort of making the case that the gospel is about finding yourself through giving yourself away. I mean, and that's not where Plato was.
Oh, yeah. On the most elemental level, exactly. Yes, Plato was not that spot. Yes. Nor is most of the world, whether it's the 12 or anybody else. Very few are in that. Oh yeah, I should die for this cause. I should give up my very life and existence for this situation.
I mean, to me, that's where Mark is saying the kingdom is. That when you're near, how close are you to living that out?
But I keep thinking it's very interesting that you could have the two levels of meaning there, that, throwing off the cloak being a philosopher's cloak and all, and how this simple verse, it has two different levels of meaning, a physical meaning and a metaphor, particularly like throwing off the cloak and following on the way. It says, I'm not going to be a philosopher anymore. I'm going to follow you, Jesus, because I believe you're the right way. And since it was a Greco-Roman world that they were all in, and Mark had to have some intellect to be able to write, he would have been aware of it's just something I've never thought about before, and I'm going to mull over that a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, you stumped me.
Well, and I mean, on one level, it's the easiest answer is to say we all bring different interpretations to all the texts, right? We can look at one text and hear from one side, right? Like just to hear about this is what a true disciple looks like. Another is to hear from someone who is blind, who would say that's salvation by itself. I don't have to go with the discipleship, right? Just to be healed. And another person would say, a philosophy student might say, wait a second, what's this whole philosophy thing that's suddenly in the middle of my Bible, right? I mean, and all of them have different, we can have those different meanings and hold them in tension without anything being hurt in the text at all. In fact, we do it pretty regularly, if we're honest about the texts. Old and New Testament alike, we look at things and hear them very different ways. So we have a little bit of time. Next week, we will look at chapter 11, which is the triumphal entry, and Palm Sunday, either way you want to talk about it. And then the shift very clearly at that point, it's all Holy Week. It's all the last week of Jesus's life. And this is that thing that people always find amazing, but stat-wise, it's true for all four Gospels. Fully 1/3 of the New Testament, or the 1/3 of the Gospels are always about Holy Week. Jesus's entire birth, ministry, everything else is the first 2/3-ish of the text, but a full third of it is Holy Week, that last week, and what happened, and how on earth do we end up on a cross, as well as what does it mean. It's clearly the most important thing that all four Gospels are trying to figure out. Why did he have to die? What happened that got him to that point? What does the resurrection mean, right? So looking ahead, that's what we will be wrestling with for the next, I don't know, 5-6 weeks, give or take. There's 6, well, 5 and there's 5 full chapters, and then we have the fascinating sort of very brief narrative in chapter 16 about Easter. So we'll look at all of those coming up, but should be fun just to make that turn. Anything else we want to look at, chat about? Perfect. All right, my friends, good to see you all. Have a great day, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay, thanks,
Bye,
Bill.
have a
Good to see
rest of the
everybody.
week.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Have a good rest of the week.